Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the DME for Peace community wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, otherwise known as the best, most innovative, and greatest learning webinar there is in the evaluation field. I crack myself up. My name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground, based here in Washington, DC. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Anne Hendricks-Jenkins, who is a senior advisor at the Movement for Community-Led Development. And Anne is going to lead a discussion on the transformative potential of community-led development. Just a note to the audience, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it in the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address that as soon as we reach the question and answer section of today's discussion. I'm now going to hand over to today's guest. Anne, you're very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that kind introduction, and just excited to be here. I am not like an official M&E person or a researcher, but I am a consumer of all the great stuff that comes out. So this thing that I'm going to describe today has been a great learning opportunity for me and all my colleagues, and hopefully for those of you who are attending the webinar as well. So quick qualification before I begin. One is that I'm going to talk fast and go through kind of a lot of material, and it's designed so that later when you want some more details, you can just get these slides and read through them at your leisure. So I sort of break a little bit of the rules with how many words you're supposed to have on a slide for two reasons. One, so that people can go back later, and two, because not everybody speaks English as a first language, so sometimes it's a little easier to follow a webinar when the words are written out as well. Okay, so coming to you from the Movement for Community-Led Development, and I'm talking today about the fact that community-led development needs a solid and evolving evidence base, and a lot of us have come together to sort of figure out how we can learn about community-led development in a methodical and systematic way. For the sake of communities, of course, who are always the center of everything, but also practitioners, policymakers, donors, advocates, researchers, and more. So today, I'm just going to give you like the 2-second overview of what is community-led development from our point of view and the movement. What is our CLD learning agenda? CLD stands for Community-Led Development, and our research project. Just to sort of wet your whistles, there are 6 initial elements of community-led development that came up sort of in our first pass. Those are still being refined, but the 6 elements kind of give you a indication of what it looks like to try and build an evidence base around community-led development. Then we had to focus on research framing and methodology, and then we'll give you a quick update on our current research effort. So here's sort of one way that we talk about what is community-led development sometimes, because those of us who are so in it, we take it for granted that everybody knows what it is. But of course, not everybody does. So the idea is that if you think about, you hear a lot of debates about what development approaches are the best, or which sector is most important, which ideas are going to stick, and which are passing trends, and sort of how to make sense of the crowded marketplace of ideas in international development. The answer from the community-led development point of view is all of them. All of them are potentially great and often can be really important and impactful, but only under certain circumstances. And those circumstances are when the relevant ones are selected and crafted into a mosaic by those whose own lives are at the center of it all. And anyone who's been in development long enough knows that a lot of times the pressures of development lead us to push forward sometimes without very meaningful consultation with regards to the people whose own lives are the center of the work that we're doing. And increasingly, development results are running into a wall because of that lack of local ownership and consultation. So we're here to try and figure out what it means to make sure that community-led development is the center of international development. And, we're hearing it from all sides. We've heard from USAID asking for Community Development 2.0. There was a great community development effort a few decades ago, but it got a little bit eclipsed by sector-specific approaches. USAID is asking who knows how to work on social capital and aspiration, and I think a lot of people and organizations in development do know how to do that, but the evidence base has not been assembled very systematically. And then also there is a new narrative for locally led development emerging, and so we're trying to help shape that narrative so that it's as practical and meaningful as possible. So community-led development, one way you can think about it too, is that it brings into play a lot of these things that we all agree are important, but often are sort of focused on in a fragmented way. And that fragmented way results in lack of sustainability, lack of local ownership, you know, resources not being available beyond the end of a project, accountability that's not going in the right directions, inclusion gets missed, women, youth, marginalized groups don't benefit from development, and also we know that civil society is really a critical piece to all of this, and it kind of helps give civil society a platform for doing what it does. So as I mentioned, I'm speaking to you from the Movement for Community-Led Development. We have an awesome website. A little shout out to our chief galvanizer, Dr. John Coonrod, who I work with, who has kind of brought us all together and keeps us moving forward. We have 57 members, yes. A lot of these organizations whose logos you see, they've been doing community-led development under whatever name for many, many years and know a lot about it. So the idea is that we're coming together to sort of systematically look at what we know across the board about community-led development. And this effort is being driven by a shared recognition among the movement members and among a lot of others that, first off, we need creative, flexible, evaluative tools to build the evidence base for community-led approaches. And as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, those look different than sort of a lot of the traditional evaluation tools that are commonly used. Also, the World Bank is just one of many that recognizes the need for sharing of experience and methodological approaches across agencies. A little bit siloed right now with regards to a lot of great data and wisdom stays within individual organizations, but it's much more powerful to bring it all together. I'm not going to read all of these, but this gives you an idea of what our emerging community-led development learning agenda looks like. And it's not just does it work or doesn't it work, it's we know that it works. A lot of us who have worked in it for many years, but where does it work and how and why and how do we measure it and where do self-reliance and sustainability fit in and questions like that. So we've got an emerging learning agenda that's continuing to be refined, and we're setting out to answer some of these questions. So a specific goal of the research project that we're working on is to assess what we already know and to illuminate gaps, to produce findings that will foster effective community-led development. And then we realized that in order to do this, we need to co-create a shared understanding, framing, and methodological innovation around community-led development. So we're always trying to do better community-led development within our organizations, but really importantly, there's larger arenas that need to better understand what community-led development is and how it can be a critical tool within international development in the effort to achieve sustainable impact. So that gives you the sort of quick intro, and this part is the 6 basic elements about of community-led development that our research framing and methods need to be able to recognize and explore. And the idea is that just by starting to unpack that, some basic elements of community-led development have emerged that really aren't well captured, or the current M&E tools haven't always been framed to be able to recognize and explore these things. So here's element number 1. The context varies every time. And as the noted scientist Thomas Kuhn points out, obviously human beings share some responses to experience simply because of their shared biological heritage. Yet, different groups and the same group at different times can have different experiences and therefore, in some sense, live in different worlds. So given that the context continually varies, not just by place, but in time, how do we factor that into an evidence base that comes up with guidelines and recommendations about how to move forward and how to take context into consideration? Element number 2, community-led development is driven by intangibles, which we hate when we're trying to get like a very concrete results. It's a lot easier to measure, you know, the number of boreholes drilled or the number of children in school than it is to measure and be aware of some of these things that are not tangible, and including like social cohesion or sustainability, voice and agency, things like that. So here's a quote, that real and equitable progress requires exceptional attention to the detail and mundane work of what is invisible to me. And anyone who's visited a community-led development project, by being there and talking to the people, you get a sense of incredible things that are very hard to reduce to numbers or you know, other forms of documentation. So how do we take that into account when we're trying to build an evidence base around CLD? Number 3, accountability must be right. Obviously, in international development, there is an accountability thing, which is accountability often heads in the direction of the funder. We are accountable to our donors, to our funders, and they end up sort of in the center of things. And that accountability problem undermines community-led development, because the communities themselves, they need to be accountable to themselves, and the others who are coming in, you know, in effect tinkering with their lives, need to be accountable to them as well. So what does that look like from a project or program point of view? It really calls for changing it up a little bit with regards to how we try and understand, measure, and make sure we get accountability right. Fourth element of community-led development that is, you know, part of what's a bigger set of issues is that it's built on complexity. And so we've all heard increasing talk about systems-based approaches and complexity. And even the World Health Organization here says that unless our process encompasses the relevant aspects of complexity, we risk not doing justice to the assessment of the interventions, and our recommendations may not provide countries with the guidance they need to implement these recommendations. And as we know, the World Health Organization, they often work on clinical issues that are actually easier to measure in some ways than community-led development. And even they, within that context, are recognizing that without taking complexity into consideration, we're missing the true nature of these interventions, and therefore how to understand them well enough in order to make sure that they actually make a difference. And even though that may sound very daunting, it's actually not as scary as it sounds, but it does take some attention and thought. And just to add to that, element number 5, with complexity comes adaptation. So a workable notion of complexity is the bedrock upon which adaptive capacity is strengthened. And the fact is that community-led development, like a lot of other kinds of development, it's going to result in unexpected things, because complexity is dynamic. So, and have unexpected results. And then what do you need to do? You need to adapt based on those results. There's a whole set of capacities around adaptation, what it means to think critically, to assess what's going on, and to make changes in order to keep focusing on your goal. And guess what? When the international development people are no longer around, helping communities need it themselves. And that is a lot different than drilling a borehole. So in order to have sustained impact and scale, we've got to figure out how to support adaptive capacity within communities. And that has a lot of evaluation implications, obviously. Okay, number 6, the last one. Key to community-led development is a focus on self-reliance and sustainability, because the point is that communities learn how to envision their inclusive future, they learn how to commit to making that happen, and then they learn how to make it happen based on their own agency. And so in some places, you know, communities already know how to do this, but in a lot of places, due to a lot of historical reasons, communities don't necessarily have access to these capacities. So that's what we try and open up to them. And the idea is that if you want sustainability and you want self-reliance, 2 things that are tops on a lot of international development agendas right now, people need to be able to do the things themselves once all the experts and the international development people are gone. So what does that look like? Here's one nice looking model from the Valuing Voices project about how to conceptualize evaluation of self-reliance and sustainability. And that will include post-project evaluation. Okay, so there we go. Here's my sister's dogs, just to give you a break from all these words. They are sitting there, and these dogs are thinking about, well, how are we going to frame this at a high level, and what methodologies can we use to understand community-led development? So they're very intelligent dogs. So that's where the Movement for Community-Led Development, the research working group, has come together and started to unpack this. It's been so interesting, and we have amazing members who have contributed to it so much. So the first question is, which methodologies and tools will fit best with our efforts to build a solid evidence base around community-led development? And again, WHO, the World Health Organization, recently sponsored a whole supplement in the BMJ Global Health Journal on complexity. And here's a quote from that. Developers of evidence-informed guidance often apply processes and methods designed originally for assessing the comparative effectiveness of clinical interventions. And these methods, processes and methods, are ill-adapted to formulating recommendations on highly context-dependent interventions. So even the clinical measurement people are saying that even when you're measuring, for example, the clinical effectiveness of a biological intervention like a vaccine, it's still even going to be taking place within a highly context-dependent site, which is human civilization, and we need to figure out what the implications of that are. So this methodology is a need. Our need for methodology is emerging in these turbulent times. This is a graphic from a book called The Handbook of Emergent Methods. And the idea is that we have a need for methodological adaptation and innovation, our movement for community development and people who are trying to put this together. And we need to co-create a way forward. So what we're having right now is what's called a methods gap, because from this perspective of building an evidence base that is with community-led development as the organizing principle, there's not an established framing and methodology for that per se that we're finding. However, there are tons of great resources that we can put together to create that framing and methodology and figure out which tools fit in to the plan. So that's where we are. We're trying to fill this methods gap. There's no easy way forward, but that's what makes it so interesting. So the idea is that when we were learning about community-led development, straight up evaluation research, which looks at did the intervention do what it was supposed to do, is not sufficient, because that doesn't look at the design or the impact and what fed into the design and what happened after after the intervention ended. And also systematic review, another common approach. Again, it goes back to look more at the design, which is great, but it still doesn't necessarily look at the sustainability issue, what happens when it all closes up and goes away. And again, WHO is really struggling with this. We're not alone in our need for this. We're finding a lot of voices from around the world also asking for the same thing. So for example, WHO is trying to take in these factors when they're addressing their own guidelines, and things like voices and inclusion, and criteria beyond effectiveness, including sustainability and self-reliance. So, and attribution versus contribution, which means you can't take total credit for outcome of a complex, an intervention within a complex setting. So what does that look like? All right, USAID is really focusing on the journey to self-reliance, and they have just a few weeks ago published their self-reliance learning agenda. And 2 of their questions out of 13 speak directly to what we're also looking at here as well. Number 10, how can local, subnational, national, and regional voices, priorities, and contributions be integrated into how USAID fosters self-reliance? How can communities have a voice with regards to what's the best way to get to self-reliance? And also, community-led development has implications at higher levels as well, including, for example, national level policies and government partnerships. And then number 11, how can we engage local and other relevant systems such that they become more self-reliant and sustain results? So there it is. We're so excited to help answer that question, and really thrilled with USAID's focus on this critical set of questions. Just to say, let's see my time, I'm going to go a little faster. What we're working is from a realist perspective. So positivism says, like, in an objective sense, is this thing true or not true? With international development and community-led development, that's not a useful question. The question is, what works for whom, in what respects, to what extent, in what context, and how? So that's realism as an approach. So that's what we're focusing on. The idea is that we're still trying to be very rigorous and methodical, and there's something here called evidence synthesis, which is more rigorous than, say, a narrative review. So we're heading in that direction. In addition, a systematic review, which is a very specific thing, is more on the positive side. So we're looking more at what's called a scoping review. And a lot of these roads that we're heading down, the key to them is that they're more emergent. You can learn along the way and modify your effort based on what you're learning, but it can still be rigorous. So, so even WHO starts with scoping rather than the systematic reviews in order to put their guidelines and recommendations together. Okay, so all I'm going to talk about here with regards to meta-analysis is the reason meta-analysis in its most classic researchy sense does not fit well here is because it calls for homogeneous study populations. So, so if the context varies a lot, a meta-analysis doesn't really work. So therefore, you know, what does that leave us with? And then the other question is, what about randomized control trials? I'm not going to read these. You can read them later if you like. But the idea is that a randomized control trial doesn't really work for community-led development because of the variations in context, the inability to get a large enough N, which is a number of study participants, and it's in this kind of complexity. It's also, you can't control for everything in a community-led development intervention. So, however, that doesn't, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So it's not that randomized control trials don't have their place, but just the very rigid formalistic use of randomized control trials as the gold standard at the top of the heap is not really appropriate here. However, there are times when, say, a small randomized control trial might be just right for learning more about, say, one aspect of community-led development. So what we're at is we're doing a realist review, looking at both qualitative and quantitative evidence, looking at context, complex questions, and using it with the idea that it's going to inform policy and program design and community-led development guidelines. So we're using Emergent Design, and as I mentioned, there's the great handbook of emergent methods, and the idea is that your study and your analysis can evolve over the course of a research project. So you don't have to set a hypothesis in the beginning and stick with it to the very end, even though you realize halfway through that a better hypothesis has emerged through the course of the discovery. However, you still have to be rigorous and document everything and have a methodology so that it comes out with credible results. Okay, and then so here's where we've arrived. We're at what's called a realist synthesis, and it's looking at the mechanisms by which an intervention works or not. So again, not whether or not it works, but what makes it work and how does it work. So then you flesh that out a little bit, and we're doing a qualitative meta-synthesis. And this has been, of course, for me, a learning curve. But the idea is that if you have a PhD in research, I think you know, like, okay, that's a very specific thing. And if you follow that methodology as per, good research standards, it's a rigorous way to move forward. And that's what we're doing. So we've come along on this journey, all of us at the Movement for Community-Led Development with the Research Working Group. I want to give a minute to Gunjan, who is my colleague who is joining us, to give a little update on the status of the work that we're doing, very specifically to collect evidence across our members and use it as the starting point for the community-led development evidence base. Gunjan, are you able to talk?
Yeah. Thanks, Anne. Okay. Can you hear me? I think
yes.
I've been unmuted. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So yes, it's been a very exciting time, doing this research, and it's also something which has, as Anne said, it was a felt need within the community. And so what we arrived at was that there was so much of expertise within the community that people also wanted to be a part of it. And so the current research is structured as a collaborative effort. We have 57 movements in the organizations, and out of those, 23 organizations have actively have MERL specialists who are working on this research with us. So we have 35 MERL specialists globally in different locations, working across different time zones, but working in 3 subgroups to look at different aspects of the research work that we are doing. And the way we are looking at the first phase of the research. So something like this requires phases. It's a long process. It's iterative. There's a lot of work to be done. But in the first phase is when we are actually hoping to create a landscape of CLD programming, because that's never been done. We don't really know what is happening with CLD and where, and what kind of features are there in, say, a humanitarian situation, as opposed to a stable yet developing country context, and how CLD varies with this. And as we all know, context matters. So what we're doing for the first time is creating this landscape based on 350 evaluation reports that have come to us through these partner organizations for programs that they believe are community-led. Now, this landscape, there are more organizations that do community-led work. We recognize that, but given that we cover such a huge part of the globe, we are reasonably sure that this is going to give us a reasonably close global picture of what the CLD landscape is going to be. So we have a scoping working group which is working on doing this. In addition to this, we are looking at what do we mean by, when we say does CLD work, what does work mean? What is the kind of impact that we believe CLD will have and that we believe it should be having on developmental outcomes like self-reliance, like sustainability, and the others? And that's what we have the impact working group for. And then we have an evaluations working group, which is looking at all these various innovative emergent methods and evaluation tools that different partner organizations have been experimenting with to see which of these is most congruent with the complexity of CLD, which of it can capture the intended and unintended consequences of it. So for our first phase, we are, like Anne said, following a qualitative meta-synthesis approach. We are moving towards a realist synthesis in phase 2, and we will do a deeper dive and look at some of the causal mechanisms. And in addition to this, to all these MERL expertise, we have an advisory group with us, and this advisory group consists both of academics as well as implementation experts. The idea being that we want a healthy mix of the two guiding our work, but also ensuring that we are rigorous and that it is a robust evaluation. So we have an expert on the global expert in realist methodologies, Dr. Jill Westhoff from the University of Charles Darwin as part of this group. We have Elizabeth King, Professor Elizabeth King from New York University, who specializes in looking at community-led development in reconstruction and in conflict situations. We have Professor Ken Klenzer, who specializes in methodology and using it to, marrying it with practice and what's happening on the ground in developmental practice. And then we have people like Scott Guggenheim, who's really the person who led and founded the CLD work, the CDD work of the World Bank in Indonesia and Afghanistan. I've often heard John, who Anne talked about earlier, describe him as the Mike Jagger of community-led development. So we really have this very robust group of people in, and yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And so there we just powered through what took a lot of work about in 20 minutes. And thank you to everyone for listening as we explain all this.
Great, thank you very much, Anne, and thank you, Gunjan, for participating. I know there were some issues with the Wi-Fi connection or the quality of the recording, but don't fret. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted on DME for Peace later today alongside Anne's incredibly detailed and comprehensive slides. For those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks, we've now reached the discussion portion. A couple of notes about our format. You can submit a question in one of two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar, which will allow you to type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And just note, as I said, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion. I'm going to use my moderator's privilege here, Anne, and kickstart the questions. And it's really interesting to hear about the co-creation of an evidence base for community-led development. But I was wondering if you could take a step back and maybe provide some anecdotal evidence. Like, are there examples of community-led development that really stand out to you whenever you're talking about this process? Like, what is the gold standard? Are there things you've learned through this process that you're like, that was a great case study?
Well, yeah, let me tell you two things about that. One is that I am employed by the Hunger Project, who has been doing community-led development since the 1970s. And part of working at the Hunger Project means you have to go visit some of the sites where the communities are working in partnership with Hunger Project staff. And it's one of those things, you see it in person and you are just blown away when these people stand up with the voice and the dignity, and it's not, a dependent relationship. It is just, I visited with a group in Mexico of indigenous people that have been living in like extreme poverty for hundreds of years in a very remote location, and over the course of the last 4 or 5 years they have radically changed their whole living situation, and they have done it themselves. They have figured out how to get water, they figured out how to get a nutritious organically grown food all from their own hands in the jungles within which they live. They are having women lead the work, and one woman stood up and said, before you all showed up, whenever we tried to talk, they told us to shut up. No one tells us to shut up anymore, and we're moving forward together. and without fear. And so a lot of it has to do with the facilitation, and that's where those intangibles come in. It's not about the providing of the resources, it's about the shifting of the mindset. And that's something that we see across all of our members. You know, everybody has different names for their methodologies, but you could go on a trip today and visit 100 different amazing community-led development projects that are in programs that have been implemented by our partners and by our not partners and by communities themselves. So there's that huge amount of just real life evidence that exists all over the world that we're trying to bring together. That's the one sort of case study, and a lot of it has been written up, and you know, but it's just a little hard sometimes to separate the wheat from the chaff because there's so much noise out there in the media. The second thing is, here's the national level case study. So we're trying to advocate for national level community-led development because the greatest source of resources in the world are governments. And in Indonesia, for 20 years, they've been working on community-led development. It started with a World Bank project of some millions of dollars, and now they have a law called the Village Framework Law, which is a community-led development law. They have $7 billion in their own budget every year for community-led development. They have 73,000 villages in Indonesia that are governing themselves through a community-led development approach. And their president just got reelected. So it promotes peace and stability. It's popular politically. It enables development impact that is just of a scale that is unheard of before when you roll it out. And they're not the only country. The Philippines has done it, South Korea has done it, other places have done it as well. So there's both the meaning and the content of it, which is readily available for you know, to learn about. And then there's the scale part of it, which is also the next big nut to crack around the world.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating to watch sort of this shift towards these community-driven approaches. I know in the peace building field, for example, we've been seeing locally developed indicator projects. Special shout out to the Everyday Peace Indicators who've worked on this issue and done some amazing research, which is publicly available. I guess that also ties in with your idea of the emergent design. And I think that's a really interesting shift to see from donors to approach these projects with a more adaptive mindset. And I was wondering, obviously we can understand the pros and the positives of this emergent design, but what are the challenges that you have experienced through the use of emergent design?
I think the biggest challenge to emergent design is the idea that it's not like you're just making it up as you go along because, you know, whoever was in the room had some new ideas. It's got to be a methodical process where it's you use all the sort of best tools at your disposal, including inclusion, so to make sure that all the right people are helping contribute to this emergent design. And then you move forward together as a group, and then you sort of systematically try things out. Like lean experimentation is popular now. That's a form of adaptation in emergent design. And you break out the capacities that are necessary: the critical thinking, the planning, the envisioning, the testing, the analysis of the results. So a lot of those things are like classic research capacities, but they're put in the hands of regular people as part of their way of moving forward. And, you know, even that one handbook I mentioned has like 1,000 pages of different ways to do emergent design. So I think, you know, making sure that it stays credible from a point of view of people understanding that it is a real thing, and it's spelled out with specific ways to do it and ways to document it and ways to sort of get everybody on board so that they can do it as well. Also, it can be very accessible, as we know, like a lot of participatory research, the PRA stuff of the 1970s. I mean, that's kind of like the same set of ideas as emergent design. So it's kind of taking the best of the old stuff and then putting some new stuff in it. A big piece of the new stuff is the inclusion piece.
Great, thank you very much, Anne. Our next question comes from Safar Gondal, and Safar writes, "Hi Anne, great ideas. One question, how can we address and integrate anti-corruption measures in community-led development? There are technical deficit challenges as well."
That is a great question, because we did talk about accountability, and the idea is that your local government is a lot more accountable to you than some federal government that is far, far away. And so the ideal is that there can be community units of, say, 5,000 to 15,000 people. And once you get a certain amount of proximity and sort of more direct accountability, you can address corruption in a lot more effective ways than you can trying to address corruption at the very top. So from a decentralization point of view, the resources have got to flow down to the community level. Like in Kenya, for example, where they're devoting 20% of resources now to right straight to the decentralized levels. And then those communities need to know that those resources are there and that they're entitled to benefit from them. And they need to, that's where civil society can really come in. They need to figure out how to both be a watchdog for corruption and also a partner to local government to lead effective use of resources and address the issues of corruption. So I think that community-led development has huge potential, and it's already been shown in many places to be an effective way to address corruption. In India, for example, it's huge.
Great, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Safar, for your question. Our next question comes from Lily Crown, and Lily writes, "Thank you for the great presentation. What are the selection criteria to determine if an organization, activity, etc., is community-led?" And Lily writes to us, working at a small NGO in Jordan called the Collateral Repair Project.
Oh, thanks, Lily. I'm familiar with that project. Nice work. That is a very good question, and that's what one of our subgroups, our research working group subgroups, is delineating right now. Because you can, I mean, there's a lot of sort of quick indicators that you could tick off about community-led. You know, it's inclusive. It's you know, are women participating? What is the process for getting the input and all that? But we're trying to make it a little more clinical, so to speak, with regards to what defines community-led for the purposes of the evidence base. So keep a close eye on our research working group as they provide more guidance around that, so it can be simpler than ever with regards to trying to delineate that.
Great, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Lee, for your question. We are just at time for today. I want to thank the members of the audience for joining this edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. As a reminder, the recording is going to be posted on our media gallery later today, alongside Anne's amazingly comprehensive slides. I'm not sure we've ever got through as much content in one webinar as we did today. So, Anne, I'm pretty sure you broke a record. So please, please feel free to return to the webinar's recording and continue the discussion in the comments. This is some amazing work. And just a note to the audience, because I see a lot of new names. These Thursday Talks are community good. If you're interested in showcasing some new research that your organization is doing, an interesting evaluation that you may have recently produced, or an innovative tool you're designing, please feel free to get in touch with the DME for Peace team here at Search for Common Ground, and we would happily work with you to slot you into the Thursday Talk schedule. Thank you again for joining. Thank you, Anne, so much for your detailed presentation. We're going to be back next week to discuss organizational learning. It's going to be really exciting, and you're going to have a guest host next week, because I'm not going to be here, so it's going to be even better. But I hope you all have a great rest of the week, and we look forward to seeing you online in the near future.
Thank you so much. Great hosting. Way to go.